The stainless steel is spotless. The executive chef dictates the exact 45-degree angle of a micro cilantro garnish. The target demographic observes this directive. Their pulse does not race with the desire to obey. It flatlines with absolute contempt. They drop the tweezers. They walk out the back door. Legacy organizations operate on a rigid Escoffier architecture. They assume human capital functions like predictable ingredients in a closed system. Input a directive. Extract a standardized output. But a specific demographic is currently breaking this model. When subjected to heavy-handed oversight, these individuals do not produce standardized results. They produce asymmetric friction. The organizational hierarchy views this as insubordination. The data suggests a different classification. It is a zero-trust protocol applied to a culinary environment. The individual has accurately modeled the kitchen, identified the leadership as a liability, and initiated a localized quarantine. The legacy structure views deviation as a critical error. The Forager views it as the only method of discovering new operational parameters. The corporate world relies entirely on the brigade system. This is a top-down architecture designed for predictable, mass-produced plates, exact recipes, unquestioning execution. The decentralized worker operates on an entirely different logic. They are intuitive foragers. The hyper-independent mind operates on a frequency that the legacy system cannot decode. And the pattern that emerges repeatedly is this: their refusal to follow the recipe is rarely about arrogance. It is a visceral rejection of a stagnant menu that ruins the raw ingredients. The forager assesses the environment and refuses to participate in structural decay. A manager hands over a step-by-step checklist for a project requiring lateral synthesis. The forager identifies 3 critical points of failure in the preparation. They discard the list. The manager demands adherence to the documented recipe. The forager stops communicating. The friction coefficient maximizes. And the lingering question becomes, what exactly is happening in that silence? Observe the subject at 1400 hours. A flawed directive is issued. The physical response is immediate, a cessation of movement. A silent calculation occurs. The task is executed exactly as requested, but the intuitive synthesis, the actual seasoning that makes a project succeed, is entirely withheld. The afternoon closes. The project ships coal. The individual notices the failure, documents it internally, and does not speak a word. Which is, objectively, a remarkable amount of strategic energy to expend on a Wednesday afternoon status report. But the mechanism demands it. The data points toward a specific behavioral study regarding hazard modeling in unpredictable environments. The finding, roughly, when an individual is consistently exposed to unreliable leadership early in their development, the brain's response is not to seek better guidance. It is to stop accepting external guidance entirely, which, for this specific demographic, might explain the sheer exhaustion of the modern workplace. The tiredness is not the result of the workload. It is the metabolic cost of constantly scanning the kitchen for falling knives. This operational model traces back to an emotional scarcity kitchen. The environment was devoid of reliable chefs. There was no top-down architecture to feed them. They had to learn to cook from scraps. That was the intelligent response to a systemic failure. The environment forced them to build an internal supply chain that required zero external input. They learned to view all provided resources with intense suspicion. A reliable chef in the scarcity kitchen is an illusion. Any provision comes with a hidden debt, a string attached that can be pulled at a later date to destabilize them. Therefore, the forager learns to reject the provision entirely. They starve the dependency. They did not simply learn to cook alone. They made the act of needing a sous chef feel like a critical vulnerability. But here is the structural paradox. The original scarcity kitchen is gone. The current environment, flawed as it is not the original threat. The mechanism is still running, not because the threat is identical, but because the Forager has never asked the defense system to stand down. They maintain the quarantine. The pattern was built by circumstances. It is maintained by habit. Habits can be examined when the environment is finally stable. To hand over the knife is to return to the scarcity kitchen. The legacy system demands trust. The Forager's conditioning denies the request. A supervisor offers to take over a complex preparation to relieve pressure. The refusal is automatic. The Forager prefers the heavy metabolic cost of doing it alone. Earlier, the data asked what happens in the silence when the Forager stops communicating. The answer is predictive friction. The manager perceives this silence as a lack of engagement. The metrics indicate otherwise. They are highly engaged, but their processing power is directed toward dismantling constraints rather than executing flawed tasks. They run simulations of the project's failure. They prepare the post-mortem analysis before the stove is even turned on. They map the disaster and wait for the inevitable collapse. Organizations deploy extreme surveillance to counter this. They implement rigid key performance indicators. And the result, or rather, the inevitable secondary cascade of attempting to force decentralized talent into a rigid mold, is catastrophic. The intuitive worker executes malicious plating. This is the weaponization of exact instructions. They follow the flawed corporate recipe to the letter. They plate the disaster perfectly. They watch the project burn. Malicious plating is a masterpiece of systemic subversion. It provides the legacy system with exactly what it requested, stripped of all the unmapped variables that actually make a project succeed. The Forager knows the recipe lacks essential seasoning. They execute it anyway. They deliver the raw, unpalatable output with a timestamp of perfect execution. The organization is forced to ingest its own structural decay. The manager tastes a flavorless disaster, holding a perfectly formatted report detailing a complete operational failure. It is a highly efficient way to destroy a restaurant. The daily stand-up meeting requires a status update on a doomed initiative. The Forager reports that all milestones are met according to the provided documentation. They do not mention the structural flaw in the client's request. The project launches. It fails. The Forager packs their knife. They leave the blast radius. They are quietly building an exit strategy, a decentralized domain. They simply execute the recipe exactly as written. The data reveals a fundamental misclassification. The refusal to be managed is frequently diagnosed as a toxic ego. It is labeled an uncoachable flaw. But what the evidence seems to indicate is something entirely different. The defiance is not a personality defect. It is the immune system of their own deep-seated creativity rejecting a standardized environment. They possess a palate that cannot be mass-produced. They have deleted the requirement for the executive chef's validation from their internal architecture. They do not seek validation. They seek an asymmetric advantage. When the system realizes it has nothing the Forager wants, it loses all leverage. The Forager becomes truly unmanageable. A sudden clarity arrives. The exhaustion is not the result of the work itself. It is the metabolic cost of suppressing a decentralized logic to fit inside a closed architecture. The Escoffier straitjacket was never meant to fit. The individual recognizes their own architecture. Their constant rebellion is merely their core programming attempting to execute its primary function. The math dictates a different outcome. To extract value from this demographic, the legacy system must be abandoned. Management cannot manage a Forager by handing them a checklist. They can only give them a kitchen and mandate them to feed the crowd. For leadership, this requires outcome-based gastronomy. Hand them the objective. Remove the oversight parameters. Step out of the blast radius. Trust and cooperation must be earned through mutual respect and absolute distance. For the decentralized creator, the mandate is equally severe. Stop accepting positions as line cooks in rigid brigades. The friction will always consume the output. Strictly curate environments where the executive authority belongs to the creator. Attempting to survive inside a traditional system will only trigger continuous resistance. The energy spent fighting the legacy architecture must be redirected toward building a new infrastructure. If there is an entity in the organizational hierarchy who this describes, not you specifically, but an unmapped variable you observe, this analysis can be forwarded without an explanation. The data will speak for itself. The architecture of the future relies on decentralized talent. The Escoffier model represents a stagnant menu, but the lingering variable remains. What happens to the intuitive Forager when there is no legacy system left to rebel against? The kitchen is finally empty.